Alrighty, what I'd like to talk to you about today is a subject I call surfing the silver tsunami. And it's kind of an interesting thing. You can't really open a newspaper these days without seeing some evidence of the baby boom generation. There's in the US, there's 76 million of them. They're going to be a part of our lives for a long time to come, and they're going to influence a lot of economic and political decisions. And so I think that's, it both introduces some opportunities and some challenges. So I'm going to pop forward here. So this is the sort of graphs that you see if you look in the Economist magazine or New York Times. On the right, you see a graph showing the percentage of the population 65 and older and how that's going to change over the next 30 years. You'll note that they kind of cheated there. It starts at 12%. But nonetheless, it indicates that over the next 20 years, you're going to see roughly a doubling of the percentage of the population at 65 and over. That bulge, that post-war baby boom bulge is moving through. Well, that's interesting. So we're going to have twice as many old people. So what? So how much does it cost? I think that's more an interesting point of view. Turns out that the average 75-year-old spends about 6 times as much as the average 40-year-old on healthcare. So imagine you're in a system where there's a lot of budget that goes to paying for that. In Canada, they're predicting that will jump to around 42% over the next 10 years or so. That's a massive amount. Where's that coming out of? Transportation, education, all sorts of the other priorities of government. That's going to be a really, really big deal. And in fact, we've seen some political announcements even recently talking about limitations on how much the government's willing to spend on healthcare. And what's that going to do? I think that's a really interesting point. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is a little bit of that, but mostly what does that mean in terms of entrepreneurial response to this problem? Because I think it's a fairly stark choice, really. On one side, you've got restricting care. What are you going to do when you don't have enough dollars? Do you start telling grandma she can't have a bypass, or grandpa he can't have his hip replaced? So one of the possible responses is entrepreneurial response. Can we find better ways of delivering health care at a lower dollar number? So what I'd like to tell you today is I picked 4 representative stories of companies that we're working with, entrepreneurs that are in some way responsible for driving a vision of cost saving. I'm going to move forward, tell you about the first company on my list. So this guy on your left here is a fellow named Michael Baker. He's an entrepreneur out of Oregon, Portland. He started his career as a hospital orderly, and then he went into the Air Force, had a fascinating career there, and then he came back and he started working with various medical device companies. And somehow, through I don't totally understand, he became a senior executive with Phillips Healthcare, with General Electric, and with Lockheed Martin, when Lockheed had a medical device division. So it's kind of a fascinating background. When I met Michael, he was actually working in licensing. He was helping companies sell off technology they no longer needed. And somewhere along there, he ran into the fellow on the right there, sort of a crazy visionary by the name of Jim Curtis, who had dedicated his life to helping drive home hemodialysis. That's kind of a niche little thing, you'd think. I'll explain to you why it's not quite so niche as you might be thinking. So first, let me tell you a tiny little bit about hemodialysis. So this is a typical hemodialysis patient. They go into a hemodialysis outpatient center about 3 times a week for about 4 hours. And the reason they do that is because their kidneys have failed. And why would that happen? Well, it happens because they have diabetes in many cases. I don't know if you've heard about diabesity. It's kind of a buzzword in medical circles these days. Diabesity is sort of the combination of obesity causing diabetes, which is becoming pandemic, because of the rise in bad dietary habits. And so this is what's coming next. And the little cartridges that sit inside that machine are made at a quantity of around 200 million units a year. Give you an idea, just the sort of volumes, the size of the issue. So what happens, they go into the clinic, and this machine is kind of like an artificial kidney for them. And over the course of about 4 hours, it takes all the urea out of their blood, that's essentially urine, rebalances some electrolytes, puts some water back in there, and then they go home. But they don't go back in for another 2-3 days. So what happens in the meantime? remember that your normal kidney is working away 24 hours a day, right? So what happens to these guys, in order to give them some sort of period of reasonable balance, they way overcompensate. Then so the patient walks out of there feeling like crap. Then they feel okay for a little while. Then they feel like crap again. And then they go back into the clinic, and that's their lives. So that was Jim's vision. What if you could drive home hemodialysis? People could get filtered at night. It could be slower, it'd be better for their cells. They would be closer to the ideal balance all day long. Wouldn't that be fantastic? So what happens when you run into a guy who's licensing deals, finding all sorts of wonderful technology, meets the visionary hemodialysis guy? Well, I'll tell you what happens. They managed to license some technology from Hewlett-Packard for mixing chemistry and for dispensing it. They managed to get some other technology from Oregon State University to do with microfluidics for water treatment and for blood filtering. And then they built this whole team together. We were involved in that. And they set off to look for money. And how'd that go? Well, they were thinking they'd get money in around 6 months. And in fact, it actually took them around 3 years. But that persistence, building the team, the force of personality, that entrepreneurial drive, regardless of the challenge, somehow achieved success. They were able to raise a multi-million-dollar round out of a big banking company in New York, and they're off to the races, and we'll see how the story turns out. I told you these guys are all still in process, right? So if you look for HD Plus on the internet in the next 6 months or a year or two, whenever their story comes out, then you might be able to find something out. So next entrepreneurial story I have for you is an entrepreneurial company called HemaSonic. This company is based out of Charlottesville, Virginia. The fellow on your left there is a guy named Bill Walker. He's a professor at the University of Virginia, or he was before he took a leave of absence from his day job to go start a company. And the guy on the right there is Francesco Viola, who's a former grad student of Bill's. And so while they were in their lab, they worked on some technology. Bill particularly is a world expert in ultrasound. So he came up with some fascinating technology for assessing blood coagulation. I'll tell you about that in a second. So I will mention first that I really have a soft spot for entrepreneurial professors. These guys are amazing. They're so smart usually, pretty much always. They love to take risks. They create some wonderful technology. They can get grants, so they can get the whole company moving forward without diluting their shareholders all to hell, which happens in a lot of companies. And you know, it's a pleasure to work with them because they're really interesting. So these guys went off and they started their company. And this is a picture of blood coagulating at a MicroLevel. And so I'll tell you a little bit about their technology. It's quite fascinating. So the whole idea of using ultrasound to measure, I mean, you can have ultrasound take pictures of babies. How the heck can you use it to measure how blood's coagulating? Basically, you ping ultrasound into a sample of blood, and that makes it move. And then as the sound reflects off the blood, you can actually, if you have the right technology, measure that, and then they can actually measure tiny, tiny motions of blood. And the reason that's important is that actually something like 30% of all deaths in Western countries relate in some way to coagulating, whether it's a heart attack, whether it's a stroke. Even cancer actually normally presents as a blood coagulation issue. So it's a fascinating issue. They decided they were going to focus in surgery. Turns out there was some competing technology in the area of surgery, but it was in the central lab. So the doctor in the surgery would take a sample of blood, send it down to the central lab, do analysis. Half an hour later, they come back with some sort of an indication of what was going on. And at that point, the anesthesiologist can then take some action. So these guys figured, what if that was available locally? They went to a number of clinics around North America, talked to all sorts of doctors. Everybody got really excited about the potential, what you could do if you had this. So I'll show you what happened. So here's the company. This is winning an award as a business of the year in their area of Virginia. This is the device that came out of it. One of the critical things that allowed it to go to the bedside was solving a real problem with how can you actually take a laboratory instrument and put it in the hands of doctors. As great as doctors are, they're not necessarily the best at running lab equipment. In fact, there's stringent laws that prevent them from doing stuff like that, called CLIA. So we had to figure out how could we get this device to be CLIA waived. And it turned out the critical aspect of doing that was making a microfluidic cartridge. There was some wonderful technology there. It has chemistry in it. It allows the ultrasound to do its job. And so here's the company. They've raised money. They're charging ahead. They've made prototypes. They're out in the field working. And I can't wait to see what happens with these guys. So let me move to the next entrepreneur for you. This is a Vancouver company. This is a professor by the name of Elizabeth Maurer. She is actually a researcher at the Canadian Blood Services, or she was until she quit her job to go start a company. So she spent years developing a laser technology to evaluate blood platelets. Now, it kind of sounds like all that we work on is blood. That's not true, but I loved Elizabeth's story so much I decided to squeeze it into the presentation here. So this laser technology looks at the backscatter of laser off all these little particles. I'm going to show you a little video in just a second. And she was able to figure out a metric for blood platelet quality. Now, it turns out that platelets are infused into people all the time. And a lot of the time they fail. I didn't bring a stat for exactly how often, but it's a lot. So when you've infused these things in, then a day or two later they know whether they've succeeded, and now they got to take the person in and do it again. There's all sorts of risks, there's cost, there's time. It's a big deal if a platelet transfusion fails, particularly if it's a critical patient, which it very often is. I'm going to tell you a tiny little bit about platelets here. So platelets are small particles in your blood, and normally they're just little discs. They just float around doing not much. But if you stimulate them just the right way, in fact, all sorts of ways, such as electrical charge, temperature change, jostle them by shearing them, they touch collagen, all sorts of things. All of a sudden, they turn into these little puffer fish. You can see down in the bottom right here, that little disc is not a little disc. It's just fascinating. So this laser technology she developed would allow actually you to figure out whether a platelet transfusion will be successful. Nobody else in the world could do that. It was just incredible. So let's see what happened next. So she spun off, made a company. In her case, she was a dedicated researcher. She really didn't want to be the CEO. So she managed to find an entrepreneurial CEO. And I'll say that a lot of startup companies hire CEO managers when they should really be hiring CEO entrepreneurs, but that's another story. So this fellow's named Paul Geiger, had several success stories under his belt as entrepreneurial medical devices, and he also came in as an investor. They started this company, solved all sorts of interesting problems, and I'm going to show you the device that came out of that. The next one I'm going to show you is another Vancouver company. This is a fellow out of UBC. He's a professor of engineering physics. In fact, this guy, Andrei Marcyov, was a former classmate of mine. And we both studied engineering physics, and I left school after that to go work as an engineer. And he carried on, went to Stanford, did a PhD in genetics, of all things. And then a few years later, he was recruited to be the head of the very same program that we graduated from 23 years ago, which is where he was for a little while before he went off to start his company. So he's a fascinating guy. So one of the things that he realized through his research, that if you took a high voltage electric field and rotated around a prepared biological sample, it would act differentially on the DNA in the sample. So you could actually make DNA purify 100 times better than anybody else in the world. It was a simple enough idea, but how is it we got this far before anybody realized? And so that had very, very profound implications. Once he wrote a couple papers about it, he started getting inquiries from all over the world, people asking, can you please send us instruments? And so he hired some of his former students, and he got together making some prototype instruments. I went in their lab one time, and there was a little clock on the wall showing what time it was in Tromsø, Norway, which is where one of their instruments was, and they were having people having to get up all hours of the night to talk to the people there because they were prototypes, acting like prototypes do. So I'm going to show you next. Here's a picture of some of that laboratory sort of classic R&D sort of look, what a tech company really starts out like. Some of the interesting gels for isolating things, and the high voltage power supplies all touching each other. Isn't this all exciting? So he called this technology SCADA, which stood something to do with change in differential motion of the particles. And I think it had something to do with the fact that he liked racing BMWs, but I don't know quite how that's connected. But so this is a DNA sample migrating across a gel and suddenly woof, getting concentrated right in the middle. So out of that, he came to me one time, it was October, he said, I've got this big show in January, can you make me an instrument? Knowing that an instrument normally is like a 2-year development cycle. So this instrument on the right was basically spun up in 3 months just to go to a show and look impressive, which it did, and everybody was amazed. These guys had come out of nowhere and they had this instrument look so fantastic. And based on that, they were able to attract investment. They were actually able to get a bunch of non-dilutive financing out of some security agencies, and they got their own reasons for wanting DNA purified. And out of that came this instrument on the left, and they spun up a company. Right now, it's got over 20 people. They're busy making these things, shipping them all over the world. It's quite fascinating to go there and remember what it was like in that laboratory just a few short years ago. And, but the best of their story is actually not done yet. And the medical part of their story is not done yet. So the interesting thing, they've now learned how to isolate particular strands of DNA. Nobody else in the world can do this. These guys can do it something like 100 times or 1,000 times better than anybody in the world. And this is the next instrument that they're going to be launching shortly as well. And it's been a pleasure to be part of their story, and it'd be fascinating to see where this goes, because this is 100 times more important than the last one, which was already pretty important. So, in summary, I'd like to say these are 4 stories that potentially have significant impacts on saving money in healthcare, trying to find that balance between restriction of care and cost-saving innovations. And these are 4 out of thousands. There's thousands and thousands of companies out there that are all chasing this, trying to find ways to make improvements that will drive innovations in medical care. And I, for one, am hopeful that a bunch of them will be really successful, and that when we get to be that age, that we'll be able to access the healthcare. Thanks very much.